My name is Andy Leahy. I'm one of the DCR Rangers at the Wachusett Reservoir here in town. I work for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of Water Supply Protection. We're in charge of managing the Wachusett Reservoir and the Sudbury Reservoir down in Southborough and Marlborough, a little ways away, which are both part of the public drinking water supply system for metropolitan Boston. All right. I have with me two of my esteemed colleagues, Olivia Turcott and Alex Webb over there. They're here to view it so that maybe eventually they can take over doing the program themselves at some time when they're called upon. All right. So as I said, we're here at the Wachusett Reservoir, and we are with the team of rangers. However, we have about 70 employees that work here, and I mention that because we're going to talk a little bit about them as we get on with the program, but they range from office support staff to maintenance personnel, scientists, environmental quality staff, aquatic biologists, wildlife biologists, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and like I said, they'll make an appearance here throughout the presentation. Okay, this was put together by a former ranger who worked here named Will Anderson, and he did a great job on it. He worked with our DCR state archivist. His name is Sean Fisher. All right, so what they did was basically went through like all the documents in the state archives from the construction of the reservoir 100 plus years ago, and they pulled out any mention of fishing in those official documents. All right, so there's not like tons and tons of stuff, but there is good stuff. I think at one time there might have been more. However, in the early 2000s, the agency changed headquarters and lost a lot of stuff. Things got thrown away and probably misplaced in the shuffle, but you'll see there's good stuff in here. Main title page here is over in the Oakdale section of West Boylston. That's the West Boylston Manufacturing Company. So this is actually before the reservoir was built, but it's a nice little shot of a kid with the homemade fishing pole in the mill pond of the West Boylston Manufacturing Company. They made like wire for tires, and when the reservoir was built, they moved out to the western part of the state. But so that's like fishing in the reservoir before the reservoir even existed. So the Wachusett Reservoir is the largest hand-dug reservoir in the world. When it was built, late 1890s, early 1900s, it was the biggest water supply reservoir in the world. And the Wachusett and the Quabbin reservoirs provide clean drinking water to more than 3 million people in Massachusetts. So there's about 7 million people in the state, so it's not quite half the population, but it's approaching half the population of the state. Right. This photo here is over at the Route 12 Causeway in West Boylston, and in the background, but you can see the stone church up in the corner there, if you're familiar with that, and some of the laborers and their horses digging out the topsoil of the reservoir. All right. So a few quick facts about the Wachusett. It took about 10 years to build. Massive project, as you can imagine. It's about 4,000 acres, the reservoir. 1896 to 1906 was like the bulk of the construction of the body of the reservoir. The dam in Clinton was completed in 1906, but it took about 2 years beyond that for the reservoir to actually fill up. So it was filled in 1908. There's 65 billion gallons of water when it's at full capacity. And I said a couple minutes ago, it's about 4,000 acres. There's 37 miles of shoreline, and it remains an unfiltered water supply. And that's an important thing that will kind of come up a couple of times throughout here. All right, so there's only like 3 major metropolitan areas in the country that have an unfiltered drinking water supply. It's Boston, New York, and Seattle. All right. So a lot of like our rules and regulations that we have enforced here have to do with it being an unfiltered water supply. All right. And what that means is when the water goes to like the treatment plant, it's not going through a filtration plant as well. So without getting like too in the weeds with it, a lot of big cities will have a filtration plant where they have like there's a lot to it, of course. I don't know all of the details, but it will go through like a charcoal. The water will go through like a charcoal, etc., to get filtered out, and it's very costly. It would be very costly for us to build that, but in order for us to remain an unfiltered drinking water supply, we have to meet federal standards, federal Environmental Protection Agency standards. All right, and that has to do with like the bacteria levels in the water, making sure that the bacteria levels are low. And part of what's involved in that is making sure that the people who come to visit the reservoir are doing what they're doing what they're supposed to be doing in order to maintain like a healthy drinking water supply, right? So that's why we don't, for instance, allow dog walking. So if people don't pick up after their dogs, then they're potentially polluting the drinking water, or boating, et cetera, littering, that type of thing, okay? So here is kind of the different like iterations or different names of the transformation of state agencies that the reservoir fell under throughout its history, all right? So when in the latter, or like the second half of the 1800s, the city of Boston, the population was like increasing exponentially, right? So there was a huge population explosion during the 1800s. A lot of immigration into the area, all right? And one of the problems with that, or one of the like big challenges that the city of Boston, the city government had, was providing drinking water for this growing population, all right? So it got to the point where the city of Boston couldn't handle it, and basically the Commonwealth of Mass took over, all right? And they formed what was called the Metropolitan Water Board. And the Metropolitan Water Board was in charge of going out and looking for new sources of clean drinking water, all right? So in 1895, it was determined that the South Branch of the Nashua River here would be a good spot to dam up and create a drinking water supply reservoir that could supply the city, okay? So from 1895 to 1901, it was under the Metropolitan Water Board. 1901 to 1919, Metropolitan Water and Sewerage Board. And in 1919, the Metropolitan District Commission was formed, which merged like a few different agencies. And the Metropolitan District Commission, or the MDC, oversaw the Quabbin Reservoir, the Ware River Watershed, the Wachusett Reservoir, Sudbury Reservoir, up until 2003, when the MDC was decommissioned and the DCR was formed, Department of Conservation and Recreation, all right? There's that slash in between the 1985 and 2003, because in 1985, the MWRA, or the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, came into play, all right? And that had to do with the fact that there was a lot of like waste happening as the water was being transferred from here to the city. The like network of tunnels and aqueducts were old, there were cracks, there was a lot of water getting lost through the cracks, like hundreds of millions of gallons a day, and the MDC unfortunately didn't have like the resources in order to fix that. So the state formed this quasi-state agency, the Mass Water Resource Authority, who would sell the water and then have like the funding in order to do those necessary repairs, all right? So in 1985, the MWRA was formed, and the MDC was now just in charge of like overseeing the protection of the land around the reservoir, which is very important in order to maintain like a clean drinking water supply. You gotta make sure that the water that's filtering through the groundwater is clean, right? So here is a map of the water supply system. So it starts out west of us. So we're here at the Wachusett Reservoir. Quabbin Reservoir out here, all right. The Quabbin Reservoir, much bigger than us. It's about 420 billion gallons of water to our 65 billion gallons. The water enters into the Quabbin Aqueduct. That's what this red line is here. It's an underground tunnel that connects the Quabbin to the Wachusett Reservoir. It's 25 miles long. And water then last sees the light of day at the Wachusett, enters the Cosgrove Aqueduct, goes to Marlborough, to the treatment plant, John J. Carroll Water Treatment Plant, gets treated there, and then it goes on into the city and gets distributed to the different municipalities from there. And there's no pumping of the water from the Quabbin all the way to Boston at sea level. This is like kind of shows a map of the terrain, the geography. So it's all just gravity fed. As the water enters the tunnel, it just basically goes down a gradual slope until it gets to the city at sea level, and then it has to be pumped up to homes and businesses, etc. This is our fishing map. It's actually our old fishing map, which is, in my opinion, is actually a little bit better than our new fishing map. Some of the important things on here are a little bit easier to see, but of course the blue is the reservoir itself and the water. The different shades are the different depths. So where you see that it's like lighter blue, it's a little bit shallower. Where it's darker blue, it's deeper, okay? And that's important for people who want to come fishing here because certain species of fish like deeper water, some like shallower water, all right? So you can kind of you can use this to target different species of fish by entering the gates, which are marked by these triangles here. And those gates are all numbered. They go from 1 up to 43. There aren't actually 43 gates. Some of them have been kind of taken out of service over the years, but you can also navigate around our system of forest roads that you see in yellow there. There's a limit to fishing, which is that red line. So this north basin up here, we don't allow any fishing, and we don't actually allow any shoreline access, no public access on the shoreline. And that goes back to that EPA filtration waiver. So the EPA says, in order to keep that filtration waiver active, you can't have any shoreline access within 2 miles of the intake works, which is the Cosgrove intake. That's like across the street from the courthouse in Clinton, if you're familiar with the area. That's where the water enters the pipe and starts making its way towards the city. All right.
All those forest roads are just public access on foot, right?
That's right. Yep. We don't allow any like bikes or off-road vehicles or anything like that. This is the old Fish and Game map from 1971, a little less detailed, but some things have changed. You used to be able to fish starting at the end of each of the north and south dikes. So you can see here the north dike, which is on Route 110 in Sterling and Clinton, and the south dike, which is like across from Mile Hill Road in Boylston, kind of at the base of Mile Hill Road there. But used to be able to fish starting at Gate 3, right at the end of the South Dike. But once that filtration waiver came into play, when the MWRA was put into effect, it was moved up to gate number 6 at Hastings Cove in Boylston. That's where public access is now, begins to be allowed, okay? So this is where we get into like the references to fishing in those throughout the documents in the state archives. All right, so the first reference to fishing was June 30th of 1899, when the Metropolitan Water Board voted to allow fishing, or allow until further notice, fishing in Sandy Pond in the South Branch of the Nashua River above the dam site. So Sandy Pond was at one time behind like the middle school and the high school in Clinton, if you're driving past the high school and the middle school. And actually, if you go on Google Maps today, Sandy Pond is still on there. For some reason, hasn't existed for like 120 plus years, but it's still there. So you can get a really good idea looking at Google Maps. And here's some photos of Sandy Pond. was a glacial kettle pond, really, really deep. They started stripping away the soil here. It's 1902. And this is a view from Burdett Hill in Clinton. And we're looking along the North Dike. So the schools, high school and middle school in Clinton would be like over here. This would be the walking path along the North Dike. Today, that was a railroad bed, for those that may not have known that. And the next mention of fishing was in 1909, when the construction of the reservoir is complete and the Metropolitan Water and Sewerage Board votes to open the Wachusett Reservoir to fishing by special regulation. And what those special regulations were, interestingly enough, was that only residents of Boylston, West Boylston, Clinton, and Sterling, and residents of the Metropolitan Water District could fish at the Wachusett Reservoir. All right? So that's great for people who like to fish that are from Boylston, West Boylston, Clinton, and Sterling, and Boston. Probably didn't make people happy that lived in, say, like Princeton or like Hudson or something, you know, some other town close by. But just for your reference, I brought this paper map that shows what the Metropolitan Water District was. It was all the towns within a radius of 10 miles from the State House in Boston. So if you lived in Newton or Quincy, you could come and fish at the Wachusett Reservoir, but if you lived in Princeton, you couldn't. It was just kind of funny. But also at that time, ice fishing was allowed westerly of Greenhalgh Point and Sawyer's Bluff. Ice fishing is not allowed today. And looking at this map here, I'll show you where Greenhalgh Point is, right there. Sawyer's Bluff is over here. So westerly from there, ice fishing was allowed in 1909. 1920s, the previous regulations are repealed and ice fishing is now prohibited in all areas. Why it was repealed, we don't really know the specifics of why, but I'd like to know. And in the 1930s, 1936, salvage work was done for stocking other Commonwealth waters after severe flooding. So what that means is they were going out with like nets on boats and they were netting fish from the Wachusett Reservoir in order to bring them to other water bodies throughout the state to stock those water bodies with fish, okay? And there are some photos of these dudes salvaging fish. So we got Mr. Eugene Hultman, who was the commissioner of the MDC at 20 Somerset Street. That was the old MDC headquarters on Beacon Hill. The Hultman Aqueduct is named after him. You see that when you're driving into Boston on the Mass Pike. That was like the main aqueduct bringing water to the city for many, many years. But some great photos. I love the like old trucks with the Division of Fisheries and Game painted on the side there. Looks like some nice, like a largemouth bass and maybe pickerel, yeah. Yeah, big fat bass there. And here they're out there with their nets on their skiffs. I've been trying to like figure out where that is, what headland that is. I thought maybe it was Cemetery Island off of the North Lake, but I was looking out my window at the office today, and I don't think it is. That can be your job. Figure out where that is. Maybe Dover Point in South Bay.
I was gonna say that really looks like Dover Point.
You think so?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, we'll go with Dover Point for now,
Yeah,
with further confirmation later down the line.
Up from, what's that lowest gate called?
It's 18 year.
I think so, yeah. The one right by that water department entrance.
Another bass, and I think that's a pickerel, right? Is that a pickerel? So in 1939, the reservoir was closed due to drought conditions and concerns of wildfires, at least until 1940 season. Anybody think of any natural events around that time? Was that, what's that? Well, we'll come to that, I guess. But there was the hurricane of 38. Yeah, so the hurricane of 38 must have blown down like so many trees around the reservoir that they decided to close it because, of course, everybody's like smoking cigarettes and cigars and stuff back then, and they had concerns about wildfires. So it was closed in 1939 and then opened again in 1940, I'm assuming, until 1941. So December 8th, the MDC decided to close down the Quabbin, the Wachusett, and the whole water supply system to all public access. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th. So the next day, the MDC closed the reservoirs to public access. Conservation officers are transferred to the MDC for special guard duty. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is Will Anderson's presentation that he put together, but I added this one in here myself. The story behind this little blurb is that my mother and father were cleaning out my grandmother's house after she passed away, and she had kept like a newspaper from when the U.S. entered into like World War II, and she found this article in there, and it's about how the MDC put special guards at the Wachusett and the Quabbin and the Chestnut Hill reservoirs. I thought that was pretty cool. And they're ordered to arrest all suspicious persons and allow no one within throwing distance of a reservoir. So May 10th, MDC votes to allow fishing again after the victory in Europe, which I think was on the 9th. It was at 1 or 2 days earlier. Get back to fishing. So when they come home from Europe, you can go fishing again at the reservoir. But also, the fishing season at this time was only July 1st to October 1st, so it's only 3 months long.
Don't blink.
What'd you say?
Don't blink.
Yeah, exactly, right. And that's one of like the things that we get questions about all the time, like extending the fishing season, or will the DCR ever open up to ice fishing again? And I guess this is a good tool for us. We can point back and say, hey, it was at one time fishing season was only 3 months long. So
What's the current fishing season?
it's from the first Saturday in April until December 31st. But it's only been December 31st for the past couple of years. It was
2 years, yeah. And that was a huge gift to us.
Well, I appreciate that. You can thank our director, Kelly Frieda. She was the really one behind that. It used to be till November 30th, but we decided to extend it. We closed the reservoir to fishing in the winter to try to avoid having people going out onto the ice. And a little further on in the slideshow here, we kind of get into like the benefits that closing the reservoir down for the winter has to the fishery. The reservoir, if it freezes over at all, if it freezes completely or at all, it typically doesn't happen until the end of January, or like maybe early. If it's not frozen by the end of January, it's not going to freeze, I have found. And Kelly made the argument that it's very unlikely that the reservoir will freeze in December. However, if it does, then we can make the concession to close early. So we're getting into the 1950s, and we're going to talk a little bit about like stuff that's happening out at the Quabbin Reservoir. It's not the Wachusett. However, remember, the Quabbin and the Wachusett Reservoir are connected by an underground tunnel. So what happens out there is going to potentially affect what happens here, and it does. So in the early 50s, they started stocking lake trout at the Quabbin and rainbow smelt, which are like a little bait fish, forage fish. That swim in schools. And also walleye eggs were obtained from New York. And the idea was to introduce walleye into the Quabbin Reservoir. Walleye are like native to the Great Lakes and like the Mississippi River. They didn't really do well at the Quabbin. They didn't do well. It wasn't successful. We start getting into like the end of the 50s, and the smelt started to become a problem. Those bait fish schooling up started to become a problem in the tributaries, and also like they go up the tributaries of smaller brooks and streams in order to spawn, lay their eggs. But they also started going into the piping, the tunnels, and potentially doing damage to the tunnels. So it was like, okay, the smelt population is too successful. So they eventually wound up having to like take measures in order to reduce the amount of smelt. And laker introduction at the Quabbin is also successful. I'm not sure exactly what that means, if they found that they were reproducing or not, because there's mention to them finding that they like Fish and Game biologists finding that they're reproducing later on, but it could just be that they weren't officially found to be reproducing until later. But so in the next year, in 1959, MDC started introducing copper sulfate into the tributaries of the Quabbin to kill the smelt eggs, and they were also like going out with nets and dipping the nets into the tributaries to remove the smelt, and they removed like 5 tons of smelt just by netting them. And shoal spawning is documented. So this is pretty like fascinating to me, at least. As I said, the smelt were going up the tributaries to lay their eggs, but some of them must have been also spawning on the shoals. So like this sandy, like sandbar or gravelly areas, shallow gravelly areas in the reservoirs. Because when they introduced the copper sulfate to kill the eggs, they didn't like kill all the smelt. The smelt just changed the way that they were breeding, and they were now no longer going up the tributaries. They were just breeding out on the shoals. And like, I've heard old timers that fish the reservoir say the MDC killed all the smelt and they introduced a new species of smelt, and they didn't do that. The smelt just on their own kind of adjusted the way that they were reproducing. So.
Can you imagine what the volume of 5?
I know, yeah, it's a lot. Right. Right. So early 60s, they stopped trying to introduce walleye at the Quabbin. Apparently the water was too acidic for walleye, or at least that's what they determined was the factor. But they dumped a bunch more in, 900 more in anyways. And here again, 63, 64, lake trout apparently are, officially reproducing at the Quabbin. And in 1963, the MDC votes to allow fishing on Sundays for the first time. So apparently up until 1963, you weren't allowed to fish the reservoirs on Sundays. As I'm assuming part of like the blue laws where you couldn't buy alcohol, or all the stores would close, every store would close on Sundays. And I actually had a phone call at the ranger station a couple of weeks ago from, it sounded like an elderly gentleman who he was asking questions. He hadn't fished the reservoir for a long time, and it was like on a Saturday that he called, and he was looking to come out with his friend the next day. And I was like, oh, are you planning to come tomorrow? And he was like, oh, tomorrow's Sunday. Like as though, you weren't allowed to fish on Sundays. So apparently he hadn't been fishing here since 1963 at least. But it's great that he decided to come back. So this down here is a copy of the old fishing license that you used to have to obtain specially. So we talked a little bit before about those special regulations for these eligible folks from these certain towns. If you wanted to come and fish the Wachusett Reservoir, you had to go to the power station, the old MDC administration office at the Wachusett Reservoir, which is that building down below the dam in Clinton, that they've been working on for a couple of years now. So you had to go to the old administration office in that building and purchase a copy of one of these licenses. When they first started issuing them, I think they were 25 cents. But but this gave you permission to fish at the Wachusett Reservoir. All right, and a lot of these rules and regulations that are on here from the 60s are the same as what we have today. Without reading like through the whole thing, you have to fish within these certain areas during daylight hours. Can't fish from the dam or the north and south dikes. No smoking. What else? If you violate any of the rules and regulations, your permit can be taken away. No littering. Nothing that may pollute the water. Don't throw anything into the reservoir. You can't smoke or build campfires. You have to be in possession of this permit, and any MDC employee can ask you to show you the permit. And like I said, it could be taken away if you violate any of the rules and regulations. In 1968, lake trout and rainbow smelt stocking resumes at the Quabbin, and screens for the intakes are studied. So apparently before 1968, there was no screen on the pipe where the water enters into the tunnel from the Quabbin. But it seems like it would be a good idea to have a screen on there. So 69, MDC removes the residency requirement, so you don't have to be from Boylston or Sterling or Clinton, or West Boylston in order to fish the reservoir. Anyone from anywhere in the state with a valid fishing license can come and fish, and the cost for that is 25 cents. I looked that up. In 1969, it was like $2, or it was like $2.20 or something in today's currency. And getting into the 1970s, basically the same copy. This is another copy of the Wachusett Reservoir fishing license. It says more or less the same thing, except that there's a little blurb added in here about the Sudbury Reservoir. And if anybody here is familiar with the Sudbury or fishes down there, I'll just mention that quick. The areas where you were allowed to fish there have changed too. You could only fish in the section of the reservoir that's in Marlborough, so it was like the very northern section of the reservoir. Now it's all open except for the dam. So in 1970, in order to buy your permit to fish at the Wachusett, the price increased to $1. I guess in 1971 it increased to $1, which was like $8 today. And screens are installed at the intake works. So they put screens over the entrance to the aqueduct at the Cosgrove, that facility across from the courthouse in Clinton.
Imagine doubling the license price in a year now.
Yeah, I know.
Riots in the streets.
Yep. So in 1973, in April of 73, there was discussion about allowing night fishing at the Wachusett. All right, and that's what's happening over here, okay? There's this argument being made that night fishing should be allowed. And folks from the Metropolitan District Commission are discussing this. And these are some of the arguments against night fishing, is that the pollution load will be greater. Fishing is not the problem, but human wastes on the shoreline is the problem. Fishing trips are family excursions. They increase the number of people that are coming to visit here, thereby increasing potentially litter or human waste. There's a greater difficulty to control, so like there's not staff here overnight. At least at this time, there wasn't. And litter is likely to increase. You might have to increase the cost of maintenance and potentially fire hazards. And then the next page is arguments for night fishing, which some of them are kind of funny to me. Well, there's no great objection amongst Water Division personnel. It should be on a trial basis. They're saying here, number 3, is that it's already happening illegally, so kind of why not do it anyways? Some fish species are more easily caught during darkness, and there would be no need to establish new facilities, potentially no impact on bird or animal life, and it would be a good image for the MDC to open it to night fishing. And it was tried. So this is this little memo between a couple of folks in the MDC saying, we had this conversation about how we voted to permit fishing at the Wachusett and Sudbury reservoirs on a 24-hour basis for a trial period between October 14th and April 14th and October 23rd, 1973. So from April to October of 1973, night fishing was allowed. However, after 1973, there's no mention to night fishing anymore. So apparently, this is another area where the trial was unsuccessful. Something happened, or they had problems, found that it wasn't a good idea, and night fishing at the Wachusett and Sudbury reservoirs is off the table now. However, night fishing is still allowed at the Quabbin Reservoir today with a special permit in certain areas if you're interested in night fishing. So 1973 again, this is kind of interesting, like newspaper clipping of Richard Derez of Grafton Street. He's got this northern pike that he caught in the Quinnipoxet River near the Wachusett Reservoir. What's crazy about this is there's no northern pike in the Wachusett Reservoir. And it was believed that this year they had like crazy flooding, and it's thought that like the flooding was so high that some other water body must have connected to a tributary to the Wachusett, and this pike like made its way into the Wachusett, at least the Quinnipoxet River, which is one of the main tributaries to the reservoir. So that was probably like a one-time deal that will never happen again.
It'd be really interesting to see where they were stocking the pike back then.
Yeah, I know. I'm curious where that might have come from. I know. So in the latter part of the 70s, similar to the night fishing discussion, there was a discussion to bring up ice fishing, reintroduce ice fishing. And it didn't happen, but we can talk about some of like the things that they were discussing here. Similar to night fishing, they're saying that there is already some illegal ice fishing happening. Not a lot, but there is some. I guess these are arguments against ice fishing. So, without reading this word for word, they're basically saying that like the Wachusett Reservoir is a world-class fishery, and part of the thing that makes it a world-class fishery is that it's closed for a certain time during the year, and that these fish have time during the winter where there's no pressure on them, no angling pressure on them, and there would be more pressure, of course, if they were being targeted during the winter. 1979, lake trout first sampled in the Wachusett Reservoir by Mass Wildlife staff. We talked a few slides back about lake trout being stocked at the Quabbin. They were never stocked here at the Wachusett Reservoir, and it's thought, and probably true, that they just made their way down the aqueducts from the Quabbin, either as fingerling lake trout, or before the screens were added onto the intake works, maybe adult fish made their way down.
Talking about stocking, are you talking about annual introductions, or is that also just...
Sorry, what did you say?
When you talk about stocking,
Yeah.
Are you talking about annual introductions, or is it, is that the same term for if something just gets established after?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, it would be like the Fish and Game department, like annually introducing those fish in, like for the purpose of anglers in order to catch them. In the 1980s, salmon stocking started happening. So Fish and Game raised Atlantic salmon, which typically have the life cycle of spawning in fresh water, spending their adult life out in the ocean. They were stocked in these tributaries of the Wachusett Reservoir: Gates Brook, Trout Brook, East Wachusett Brook, Justice Brook, Stillwater River, Quinnapoxet River, and you can see how many of them they introduced. They were introducing 3 to 4 inch landlocked salmon, so they're little fingerling sized salmon. And in a lot of these brooks, well, they're putting 300 to 400 in Gates and Trout Brook, a couple thousand in East Wachusett and Princeton, which you cross that on like Route 31 in Princeton if you were coming south from the center of town. 1,500, that's supposed to be 1,500. 2,000 to 2 to 3,000 in the Stillwater River, and 10 to 11,000 in the Quinnapoxet River. The only tributary that really they took to was the Stillwater River, and we have a healthy landlocked salmon population at the Wachusett Reservoir today, and it's like kind of one of the highlights of the fishery here. Really, they're reproducing. They have a self-reproducing population. So, like I mentioned, where typically in the wild, where salmon will have that spawn in the freshwater tributaries, grow up a little bit, head out to the ocean, spend their adult life, and then come back to the tributaries where they were born to spawn. They kind of do the same thing here at the reservoir, where the adult salmon will go up the Stillwater River, lay their eggs up the river, and then they'll come down and spend their adult life in the reservoir, as though, you can think of it like coming down to the ocean and then going back up the Stillwater to spawn when they get to that age. So that's one of the fish that's like heavily targeted by anglers when they come to visit here.
It's wild, they put 10,000 in the Quinnapoxet.
Yep.
What year was the dam installed that they just took down?
That was put in the 30s when they were...
Yeah, right?
What's that?
That's so crazy. They relied on that one little fish ladder for so long.
Yep, and I don't think that fish ladder ever really worked.
No, it never did.
I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get
Interesting.
further on.
To think about.
Yeah, definitely.
And then how
I
we
know.
get out of our history.
Right. No, you're right. In the 90s, lake trout that previously entered the Wachusett Reservoir through the Quabbin Aqueduct have established a self-sustaining population using smelt as forage. So I think that they had probably established a self-sustaining population much earlier than that, but that's like fish and game biologists are like officially stating that in the 90s. And the reservoir today. So we have a bunch of state fishing records. So these are like the largest individuals of these species caught in any water body in the state. All right. So we have the white perch record at 3 pounds 8 ounces. That was caught in 2016. That's actually, I believe, a world record.
It was a world record. It stood for years.
13-pound rainbow trout from 1999. 8-pound smallmouth bass, 91. 10-pound salmon. 19-pound brown trout in 1966. And then there's a catch and release category that's kind of new in the past few years, where you don't have to kill the fish and take it to like a official bait shop to get it measured and weighed. You can like measure it out in the field and release it back in to be caught another day. But in 2024, a gentleman caught a 39-inch lake trout here that weighed 20 pounds. I think it was estimated to weigh 20 pounds. So that's the catch and release lake trout record for the state. 22.5-inch smallmouth bass and an 18-inch white perch. It was an 18-inch white perch caught in 2018 and then another one in 2022. So they're kind of tied, I guess.
And that lake trout record was beaten twice in a week.
Right.
This year. Yep.
Yep. All right. So we do, when I say we, I mean the DCR and Division of Fish and Game. Nowadays we do this every 5 years, but previously it was a little more sporadic. But every 5 years we do what's called a creel survey. So we'll go out and on a schedule, the rangers and Fish and Game employees will go out and like survey people who are here fishing at the reservoir, and we ask like certain questions like what type of bait are you using, what type of fish species are you targeting, how long have you been here fishing today, what have you caught. We ask where they're from. We don't get too personal, but like your zip code. And we take all that information, we give it to our aquatic biologists, and they kind of crunch the numbers. And these are some pie graphs from creel surveys that have taken place over the years. As you can see, one from 1980, 98, 2011, 12, and 2017. We did one in 2022. I don't have the graph for that one. Biologists haven't supplied me with that yet, but it's interesting to kind of look at like how the numbers have changed over the years. So you can see the greatest number of the largest number of a certain species of fish that were caught in 1980 are yellow perch, followed by sunfish. And then we're looking down at like rainbow trout and other, etc. 18 years later, I guess this is kind of a long time, but 18 years later, now it's like lake trout are the largest number of a certain species that are being caught at 27%. Sunfish, yellow perch are like now number 3 on the list. Smallmouth bass, and down the line. And now when we're getting like closer to present day, still a little ways back, but lake trout are the dominant fish species that are being caught in 2017, and that holds true today, and probably pretty similar numbers in the 2022 creel survey. I would say lake trout and smallmouth bass are probably the 2 largest numbers of a certain species. Okay.
Is that because of targeting or just population?
Population, yeah. And what's interesting, I would like to, it's too bad we don't have numbers from like going further back, because when you talk to folks who fished here like in the 60s and 70s, they say that like the brown trout were the big fish species, similar to what lake trout is today. It was brown trout, and now brown trout they're not even making the list. It's kind of seems rare when somebody catches a brown trout nowadays.
Sandy Pond was a well-respected brown trout fishery.
Say that again?
Sandy Pond.
Sandy Pond, yeah.
Before the reservoir, it was known as the best brown trout fishery.
Yeah, so the lake trout took over. And here we got some images of our aquatic biologists. They're out electrofishing. So they did some surveys a few years back where they like shock the water and it like stuns the fish, and they can then do whatever they do to study those fish, see whatever types of species are kind of dominant in that area. From what I'm told by them, the reservoir isn't, and this is a good thing, I think, the reservoir isn't salty enough to really make electro fishing. Like it just doesn't work so well because there's not enough like conductivity in the water, and that's good. Hopefully it stays that way. One of the big problems that we're looking at these days, however, is an increase in salinity from like road salt in the wintertime. So, but we have programs working against that. So hopefully it stays that way. You can look at some images of some of the fish that are here. Yeah, here are some fish. These are basically the same images that are in these maps for the most part, these handouts.
So there's no additional permitting for fishing the reservoir now?
Nope. Yeah, as long as you have your state Fish and Game fishing permit, then you can come and fish here. I'm not going to like talk about each one of these, but you can just take a look at them. Most of these are accompanied, I shouldn't say most of them, a lot of them are accompanied by like photos from the biologists out doing their surveying. There's a little perch in there as well. I don't think you're going to catch very many brook trout in the actual like main body of the reservoir, but in the tributaries certainly would. We get folks here occasionally, especially in the summertime, as the Rangers will work late on certain days, like late work till midnight or what have you. And we'll get people that are here fishing after legal hours, and a lot of times they're trying to catch those bullhead. It's like a more active at night. So here's the former brown trout record from 1955. This little pickerel. So our biologists could come in and give you a much more detailed description of what they do when they do their fall lake trout sampling. But it's an annual event that they do where they go out. Typically, it depends on like the weather has a factor, the temperature of the water. But they go out typically in like end of October, early November, and they will do lake trout sampling. So they're like netting for lake trout, typically on the spawning grounds where they're going to like lay their eggs. And they put these pit tags, they're called. It's this little like microchip type device into the stomach of the fish. And they can then hopefully re-catch that fish in years down the line, and they like can scan the fish and they can get like biological data from it.
I think at that point too, they trim the adipose fin so they're able to identify which fish have.
They do, yep. So this is our outreach poster that we put up at our popular fishing gates, which informs anglers about this like pit tag and ways to identify a lake trout that might have a pit tag. And like this gentleman here just stated, the biologist will clip off the adipose fin. So that's a way to tell that this fish probably has a pit tag. It's not to say that they couldn't lose their adipose fin some natural way, but it's probably going to be because it was pit tagged. So we ask that people that catch a lake trout that's been clipped and tagged to please release it back in. You don't have to if you don't want to. If you're hungry, you want to go home and eat it for lunch, you can do that. You just have to make sure you don't swallow a microchip, I guess. And these next few slides, I can't really, I apologize that I can't really interpret these in a great way for you, other than to say that it's more scientific than my brain is built for. But essentially what it's saying is that a laker in the Wachusett Reservoir is healthier at a certain length than the lake trout that's caught at the Quabbin Reservoir. So I guess we can be proud of that in a certain sense. And it was explained to me what like all of these mean. Maybe some of you could like interpret that. I can't really, and I think that's okay. But here's another. It's the conditioning factor. What's that?
The one on the text on the right side.
Yeah.
It's a salmon.
It's like if you catch a fish species of like a certain size, then the Fish and Game will give you a pin, like you get it's like an award. Yeah, a recognition award. That's a good way to describe it. This was a lake trout that was caught during their biologist's annual lake trout survey. I think it was like 24 and a half pounds. Like if somebody had caught it while they were fishing with a rod and reel, it would have been the state record. But it was caught with a net, you know. And
Did they catch it at like trout fishing?
no, they were netting, yeah. And actually, the Wachusett Reservoir had the lake trout record up until maybe like, I want to say it was 6 years ago or something like that. I think it was 20, if I remember correctly, maybe you know, I don't know, it was 23 pounds. Yeah, I think it was like 23 or 24 pounds. But someone out at the Quabbin caught a bigger one. I think it only beat it out by a few ounces, but now Quabbin has the state record for lake trout. And here's an image of landlocked salmon. Beautiful fish. Largemouth bass, little largemouth bass. Very pretty. Rainbow smelt. It's a school of smelt. They spawn in the springtime, and typically like around the time of opening day of fishing is when the smelt are spawning. And there have been times when just walking the shoreline in the shallow areas, there'll be like schools like this. They must be spawning on the shallow areas on the shoals, and if it's sunny out and the sun is hitting them, it's just very impressive sight. You'll see them washed up like that after they spawn. Wind blows them up on the shore, or they get chased up on the shore by bigger fish. Smallmouth bass is also one of like the really targeted fish here. I would say probably lake trout, salmon, smallmouth bass, and rainbow trout are like the top four. This is one of our biologists' joy, holding big smallmouth. White perch. And here's Valpacuco. Had that state record. White perch. I think that was from 2016, if I remember correctly.
That was the world record.
Yep. There's Joy again holding white perch. It's a big white sucker. Yellow perch. And this is our, please don't do this slide. So one of the things that we as rangers and a lot of our environmental quality or the kind of scientist staff are heavily focused on is making sure that people aren't introducing any potentially harmful invasive species into the reservoir. All right, so some of our rules and regulations, especially like the one that comes to mind first is boating. One of the reasons we don't allow boating is because there's the potential that somebody could be boating at some water body that's got invasive weeds, and then they come the same day, put their canoe or kayak into the Wachusett Reservoir and introduce those weeds in, and it takes over, and it has a negative impact on water quality, potentially. And you might see, for instance, if you're driving around the Oakdale section of West Boylston this time of year, you'll see some boats out there that look like those party barge type boats with divers that go down, and what they're doing out there is actually pulling up invasive Eurasian milfoil, which I think is what's in that photo in the middle there. It's milfoil. And that can take over like the native aquatic plant population, and it's harmful to aquatic life and the other plants, and it could decrease oxygen levels in the water and have like a trickle down effect, I guess you could say, negatively. We ask that people that come to fish the reservoir don't put like their bait buckets into the water. You'll see like if somebody came with live bait like shiners, a lot of times the bait buckets will have like holes in the side, and you can put it into the pond or the river or what have you, and it kind of like acclimates the bait fish that are in the bucket to whatever like water body you're fishing that day. And but you could potentially introduce harmful invasives that way. So we ask that people don't do that, and just make sure that anything that you're coming here with, like I said, you're not dumping bait buckets in aquariums, or we don't really have to worry about boat trailing or anything like that here. Boats or trailers here, but definitely out at the Quabbin, they have strict regulations out there. We had actually a scare like 2 or 3 years ago where there was all of a sudden tilapia in the reservoir. Somebody must have thrown like tilapia in, and there was a couple of different like coves where they showed up. They were over by the Stone Church in West Boylston, 2 coves over there, and a cove by the North Dike in Sterling. And there were like maybe like 10 or something in each cove. And that was when like I learned about tilapia. I thought it was, apparently there's many different species of tilapia, but they typically live in like warm water, like they'll live down south in the Gulf of Mexico. Places that don't freeze essentially. So we were worried that the tilapia was gonna like explode, have this like explosion of tilapia population. Thankfully, it didn't happen. I guess they say that like if the water temperature gets down below 35 degrees, it kills them off, and we were like crossing our fingers hoping that that's what happened, and it did. It killed them, thankfully. But they did go out with the electro fishing equipment and tried to like shock them, and it didn't work. Tried netting them, weren't really able to get them, so it was basically the last recourse was hope that the reservoir gets cold enough that winter to kill them, and it did, so that's good. And the last thing that I'll talk about is the Quinnipoxet Dam removal. So there's 2 main natural tributaries to the Wachusett Reservoir, the Quinnipoxet River and the Stillwater River. There's a bunch of little brooks and things that flow into, but the Quinnipoxet and the Stillwater are like the 2 main ones. So this is a photo of the Quinnipoxet River in West Boylston, and this is at the end of River Road. And this building that you see here is the Oakdale Power Station. We also call it Shaft 1. And what's happening here is this is where the aqueduct from the Quabbin Reservoir flows into the Quinnipoxet River. So this is like where the tunnel from the Quabbin to the Wachusett ends here, all right? Water will flow out through that tunnel right there. And when the Quabbin Aqueduct was built in the 1930s, they also built this dam here on the river, and they called it the accretion dam. So I think what the idea is that this dam was supposed to like catch sediment as it was coming down the river, and so it wouldn't mix with the water coming out of the aqueduct. And I guess it did that, but it was determined that it was unnecessary, I should say. And all it was really doing is like impeding wildlife traveling up and down the stream. It's just like a barrier to fish and, turtles or other wildlife. There was a fish ladder over here on the side, but I guess the way that they designed it, it was too steep, and the water coming down the fish ladder was too strong. The current coming down the fish ladder was too strong, so fish couldn't really make it up there. and that's probably a lot of the reason why the salmon that were introduced into the Quinnipiac. This is where those 10 or 11,000 salmon were introduced, and they didn't take. So, anyways, last year, the MWRA funded a project to remove that dam. So this is what it looks like yesterday, actually. We took these photos yesterday. So now the river's all open. It's been really cool watching the project, like over the past, whatever it's been, 8 months, something like that. So in order to like remove the dam, they had to divert the river, and they put pumps in up here. They put pipes into the river with generators pumping the water up and like piping it over land and then dumping it back down here. They built an earthen dam up here to kind of catch the water back there for the pumps. And then they built like a diversion channel that kind of like took water around where the dam was, and while they had machinery in there like removing the like granite and the concrete and stuff like that. So they're basically almost done with the project now. More or less they're done, I think, with like the big part of it. Now they're kind of landscaping the riverbank. These are willow stakes they put in the ground. They're like cuttings of willow branches that are starting to grow so that the roots are able to stabilize the riverbank. And you can see here, this is another image of where you can see the outlet of the aqueduct. And there was an old ADA, like a handicap fishing platform over here. They're building a new one down here. So that's still under construction. But what's cool is I've heard a report that somebody has already caught salmon like upstream from here. So salmon are going up the river, apparently. So that's like a success story already. And we're having problems with people trespassing there like every hour. So that's a little bit of a headache. Yeah. Yep. And that's that. So here's the credits.
You talked about how it took years for the reservoir to fill. Do you know if it was just filling with the tributaries pouring in, or were they also releasing water from the aqueduct into it?
No, it was just a tributary.
Yeah, it was just the tribs, huh?
Yep, because the Quabbin wasn't built until the 1930s. So the Wachusett was filling in 1900 to like 1908. The Quabbin wasn't built until the 30s.
Yeah, I never even put that together.
40s.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yep. So it took like 5+ years for it to fill. Even while the dam was being built, they were already starting to fill the reservoir up. The dam was like half constructed, and they were already starting to fill the reservoir. Yep.
Question about, you said that they put screens in.
Mhm.
What were the screens, the purpose of the screens? What were they trying to prevent from coming through?
I'm guessing things like fish, debris, like logs and things like that might make their way in there, or like plant matter and stuff. I've talked to like MWRA employees at the Wachusett Dam because water still makes its way through the dam to keep the natural river flowing, of course. Under normal circumstances, it's a little different right now, because they're working on the dam, so I think water is not flowing as it typically would. But talk to the MWRA employees who go out and they have to change the screens out, maintain that, because I'm sure it gets, over time, I don't know how long it takes, but stuff covers the screens, so. Yep.
I think you mentioned it already, but I just didn't hear it. Why was ice fishing outlawed in the first place?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, I can tell you why we don't allow it today. Basically, we don't allow any bodily contact with the water.
Yeah.
And like, contact with the ice is contact with the water. So, I've heard like theories throughout the years that I don't know. I mean, I can't like quote this as gospel, but I've heard it said that if the reservoir freezes, you know, it being a drinking water supply, the level is fluctuating all the time. So there could be the potential that like there's this frozen surface and then there's like a drop between the
Air pocket
shelf
between,
and,
yeah.
and you know, if somebody falls through there, that's not good, of course. Probably had to do with also people who are ice fishing are probably having campfires and littering and you know, you have your bodily necessities while you're out there, and then none of that is going to be good for the water supply. So, yeah, and those. Sorry, those are all kind of theories, but
It's interesting.
okay, yeah.
The good thing about that is there's nothing in the reservoir that isn't in the mill pond. And you can ice fish the mill pond.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. Maybe not as exciting, but you're right. That's true.
Free exciting pull
Yeah.
laker out of the ice in the mill pond.
Anything Rangers want to add? Okay.
No, it's good.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.